Hello, everyone. Welcome to Random Encounter 252 or 252. My name is Jono Logan, and not only should I be welcoming you to Random Encounter, but I should also be welcoming you to Random Book Club. This is a semi-regular segment that we've been doing on the show where Hilary and I, say hi, Hilary.
Hello, everyone.
We team up and we talk about books about RPGs or adventure game or other video game related topics. The last episode we did this on was Random 247, where we talked about Bitmap Books, the art of point-and-click adventure games, which was an exploration of the art of point-and-click adventure games. It was interviews with like some of the creators and things that went into the creation of the genre. Today we have a book that is more firmly focused on the RPG part of RPGFan, and this is a book focused on JRPGs called Fight Magic Items, the history of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West, being published by Running Press. It is written by Aidan Moher, who just happens to be with us today. Hi, Aidan.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about this book with other people and to talk about Japanese RPGs with other adults. It doesn't happen as much as it did when I was a teenager and a kid, so I really appreciate this opportunity.
I know what you mean. I'd say it's like 75% of the reason that I do Random Encounter is just so I get to talk about RPGs with people, which you don't get the opportunity the same way you did when you were a kid. So we really appreciate you coming on here and sharing some of your thoughts about this book. The book is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a history of JRPGs in the West, starting with the two originators of the genre, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. The TLDR from the book's page on Running Press is: take a journey through the history of Japanese role-playing games, from the creators who built it, the games that defined it, and the stories that transformed pop culture and continue to capture the imaginations of millions of fans to this day. And now, while this is it's a history book about RPGs, it's coming at that history from a very personal angle because it really starts with your own experience with RPGs. So can you tell me, how did everything begin for you with this genre of video game?
Yeah, so Japanese RPGs are a genre that, for me, have always connected me to other people. They're single-player games, but they've always involved other people. And I go all the way back to, being a kid. I was probably, 8 or 9. I had a Game Boy. And prior to that, I had never had a game console. I had been predominantly, a PC gamer. My dad was always an early adopter of technology, so I was into stuff like, Doom, Commander Keen, stuff like that. But I had a Game Boy, and one time I was with a friend and we were visiting his cousin who also had a Game Boy. So I thought that was pretty cool. We were going to be, good buds. I was playing Ninja Turtles, Follow the Foot Clan. I was, slashing ninjas, knocking them with my nunchucks.
I owned that game. Yeah.
And, my friend's cousin said, "Hey, you want to see this game that I'm playing?" I said, "Yeah, sure. Let's do it." So he handed me his Game Boy, and it wasn't Ninja Turtles. It wasn't a side scroller. It wasn't an action game. It was this sort of weird, slow, plotting game that was almost like a board game. I was moving square by square through this fantasy world map. And then all of a sudden the map exploded into geometric shapes, and there was this big scary tiger, and it wasn't moving. And I had to select actions off a menu. I said, "Yeah, no, no thanks." Gave him his Game Boy back. Not for me. That game was Final Fantasy Legend 2, which is also known as, one of the saga games from Akitoshi Kawazu, who, I respect and really admire and love what Kawazu brings to Japanese RPGs. I don't like his games very much.
Oh, sir, you've made a friend today.
Yes, that's true.
Okay, good. I'm in the right place.
I don't. I mean, God knows, if my very first RPG was a saga game, I would have bounced off it just as hard as you did.
Yeah.
And this is a hot debate among RPG fan staff too. But I think most of us have come to a point sort of like you where we respect.
That's the thing. Kawazu pushes boundaries. He explores design space. He's never content to settle on something familiar, which is probably the very worst first experience an 8-year-old could have with Japanese RPGs. So I thought for a number of years, I hated Japanese RPGs. In those years, I started getting into epic fantasy novels. So I was, the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and then Terry Brooks's Shannara series. And then one night, my parents were out and my babysitter came over, and he was this like, cool 16-year-old babysitter. We really got along, and we always played video games all night, especially after my brothers went to bed. They're younger than me. Usually we would play Doom and Wolfenstein, the stuff that I talked about earlier. But this night he brought over a game for my brand new Super NES. And that game was Final Fantasy III. And so that was the night it all changed. Like, so I was sitting here and like, I admired him, and that was probably part of it. Right. I wanted to like what he liked, but more than that, I had this sort of like visceral experience, this like really emotional experience as I was watching him play the game and playing it with him. And like, we're exploring the mines of Narsh, which is the sort of opening city in Final Fantasy III or Final Fantasy VI. It's really like dark and grimy, and you're trying to escape the Empire. You get into combat, and then all of a sudden we step onto the game's first save spot in the mines, and there's this like ping, this like really warm, kind, welcoming ping, and the screen flashes this bluey white, and it's like a big hug. And for 3 seconds I felt safe. And I was like, this is what are these feelings? This is not like immediate danger. This is not like, reflexive action in the game like I was used to with side scrollers. But this makes me feel like I'm playing, or I'm an active participant in one of the fantasy novels that I'm obsessed with as well. And that was it. Like that, from that night forward, Final Fantasy III became like the game for me and my friends. And somehow one of my other friends then got his own copy. And I remember watching him play through it at his house. And then the cart traded hands, and we all played it one at a time. And, I never owned my own copy of the Super Nintendo version until maybe 2 years ago when my wife got me one for Christmas. So in the meantime, I loved this game, but at a point I had to pass it along to a friend. Right. Mm-hmm. And so in that time, I'm scouring magazines, and I'm like, okay, like who made Final Fantasy? What are they making next? And of course, the next thing from Hironobu Sakaguchi, but also Yuji Horii, who created Final Fantasy's rival series, Dragon Quest, was Chrono Trigger. And so I, obsessed over those magazines. I still have the game players 2 feet away from me right now with like the review of it. It's like, so well worn because I read it so much. Mm-hmm. And I just obsessed over Chrono Trigger. I finally got it for my birthday a few months after release. And that was just that was it. Like my enthusiasm and excitement for Japanese RPGs with Final Fantasy III just became an obsession after Chrono Trigger. And then that kind of took over my friend group at that point. And we all, like I said, like these games have always been social for me. So I grew up in a small community, and I had to catch a ferry to school in high school. So it was a 20-minute ferry ride and then a bus ride after that. So I had a lot of time to just like sit and hang out with my friends, right? Nothing to do. This was well before cell phones, like smartphones and TikTok and Twitter and all of that, right? So we would just sit and hang out. And so we were talking about all of these games that we loved. And that became like a really kind of personal, social time in my life, to the point where I would bring I have a Commodore 1702 computer monitor that I grew up playing these games on. I would hook up a VCR with my game consoles plugged in, and I would haul that monitor over to my friend's house, and we would sit with our TVs back to back playing Lunar, Silver Star Story Complete. And so these games are they're single player games in air quotes, but they were always social. They were always something that I connected to people over. And so, fast forward a many number of years, 15 years. And my first kid had been born. She was a couple of years old at that point. And I had been keeping up with modern games. I was still playing a fair number of games, but I wasn't playing a lot of retro games. And at some point, for some reason, I said, hey, I wonder if I can still really enjoy those games that I used to love. They are very metaphorical. They're symbolic, right? They require a connection between the player and the game. And so the way I think of it is the game happens as much in your head as it does on the screen, the same as reading a book, right? Your mind and your experiences are forming how it plays out in your head. And so I was like, do I still have that? Do I have those imaginative juices? I had a baby. My brain wasn't really working that well. So I decided to test that theory, and I loaded up an emulator, and I picked out 2 Super Nintendo games that I knew I wanted to play. I'd always wanted to play. but never had for a variety of reasons. And those games were Lufia 2 and Terranigma. They're both kind of considered classics, but I picked them because I didn't have like specific nostalgia for them. I had nostalgia for that type of game, that period of time in gaming, but not for those games in particular. So they, it was a test.
They'd be new,
right? They're new experiences. It's like discovering a brand new Super Nintendo RPG. And I loved it. Like, I was totally enamored with them.
In the case of Terranigma, literally in the case, because it was never released here.
Yes,
absolutely. I was about to ask, is it the same case in Canada as that is in the States? So I guess it is.
We never got it.
Yeah.
We got Illusion of Gaia, we got Soul Blazer, but we did not get Terranigma.
No. And but I also, as a teen, like, I knew about Terranigma, right? Like, I saw it in the back of GameFan, and I I needed it so bad. And now I was able to play it, right? And so I did play it. And I loved it. And I loved Lufia 2. And I was like, okay, these games aren't just like compelling to me as an adult, but they have new qualities that I couldn't appreciate when I was younger. And so I started thinking, I was like, well, these games, like, they've influenced me in the same ways, or, as much as any of the epic fantasy novels that I read. And, in addition to being a nonfiction writer, I'm a fiction writer. And so I started thinking about my stories, and I'm like, these have like a ton of, like, the stories that I've written, short stories and novels that I've worked on, like, they have as much of Final Fantasy in them as they do, epic fantasy novel influences. And I thought to myself, if that's the case for me, it's got to be true for other people, right? There's got to be other people who played these games as teenagers, and that inspires their writing now. And so my first professional piece of games writing was for Kotaku, and it was a piece, a big long piece exploring how there's a modern generation of science fiction and fantasy writers who were shaped and influenced as much by Hironobu Sakaguchi as they were, J.R.R. Tolkien or Ursula Le Guin. And that article really hit a nerve with a lot of readers. I got a ton of feedback from people being like, oh gosh, like, thanks for writing this. I've always felt that my writing wanted to incorporate stuff from Final Fantasy or whatever, Japanese RPGs, they inspire me so much, but I didn't know if that was an okay thing. I didn't know if you could do that. And so finding that connection to, like, the people who make the games, the people who play the games, and how they impact us as, like, individuals and as communities is something that I really wanted to write about. And so I started pitching more articles. I wrote about Lunar Silver Star Story Complete for EGM. I wrote, other pieces here and there. And I always tried to find those human stories because those are universal. But in the case of Fight Magic Items, I was able to then draw my own experiences in, because I grew up alongside this genre, right? I was a kid when the genre was sort of in its childhood, and I was a teenager when it was sort of in its adolescence. And, I had been writing a lot of these articles, and my agent, Eric Smith, is a big JRPG fan. And he actually was the one that reached out and said, "Hey, Aidan, I think you have a book here." And he specifically said, I think you have a really interesting approach to this in the way that you bring sort of nostalgia and personal emotion into your writings about these games. I think this is a book. And so we connected, and he became my agent. We worked on this pitch that was from the very beginning. Like, the very first, like, the book now is called Fight Magic Items, History of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the Rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. The very first, like, tagline for the book was Fight Magic Items, a personal history of Japanese RPGs. So that idea of bringing that personal story in there was baked into the book from the very beginning, not because I wanted to talk about myself, but because I knew if I shared those experiences, I'd find those same memories and those same feelings, that same nostalgia in other readers, because my experiences aren't unique. These games have brought so many people together and inspired so many people.
Yeah.
It's funny that you say that, because that's exactly how I felt. By writing this book through the lens of your own experiences, you're causing the reader to reflect on their own. Like, at many points in this book, when I was reading, I was relating pretty hard, because I was a Canadian kid. I had an NES, but I never played any RPGs on it. In fact, I bounced off Dragon Quest. It wasn't until I got Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy II, and it was the first time, like, oh, it's like playing a book, and I instantly connected to that. And my memories of the genre and time, like, I have very clear memories of, like, the issue of Game Players magazine with Final Fantasy III reviewed in it. It had Sonic and Knuckles on the front of it, and it had, like, Final Fantasy 3 best RPG ever and like a little circle on it. And I can't remember who, Jeff? I can't remember his last name, but Jeff, someone reviewed the game. And
Lundergan?
Yes, Lundergan gave it a 98. Yeah. And holy crap.
Yeah,
and
wow.
What you were just saying about, like, I remember the issue with Chrono Trigger in it.
Mm-hmm. I remember the strategy guide for Final Fantasy 3. I don't know if you remember that, but I was reading that during reading time at school.
Yeah.
And it was actually a really funny one.
That's an excellent use of reading time at school.
Right? I was just talking about a strategy guide for Final Fantasy 3. It's funny you bring that up. I was just talking about one of those. But like me and my friends, we had this unofficial one. It had a weird sword on the cover, but it was like gigantic, you know, like it wasn't like a regular trade style, like strategy guide like you get now. It was like a gigantic, it looked like an encyclopedia, and it would like, the amount of hours we poured over that was incredible.
Oh yeah, and it also these kind of experiences lead. I mean, a lot of, part of me saying this, like some people talk about their sexual awakenings. Well, for a lot of people, RPGs were their creative awakenings, and it wasn't just in the sense that they really connected to it. It's that they, especially our generation, who just had the internet for the very, very first time and could go online and find things like, I remember, I have no idea if, I sincerely would be very surprised if it still existed, but there was like a massive Final Fantasy fan fiction that was like multiple people were writing, and they were writing like a sequel to Final Fantasy 3. And I remember reading the crap out of that online, and it opened up so many different worlds.
Yeah, like the message boards and...
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Especially Chrono Trigger. Like, I remember the first time I played Chrono Trigger, I got sick the day I got Chrono Trigger, and I was so lucky. Like, I didn't even have to fake it. Like, I think my parents thought, you're faking it. And they looked at me and like, oh, you're not faking it. You have a fever. Yeah. But I was thrilled because I got to spend a full week playing Chrono Trigger at home.
Yeah. It's funny you bring that up because, like, I wrote this in preparing to write Fight Magic Items. I wrote a big long history of Chrono Trigger called Timeless. And it digs into, like, you know, the game, the people who made it, the people who played it, what really makes it special. And I love it, but it opens with a scene of me throwing up at school. Which is pretty funny because, you know, I was obsessed with Chrono Trigger, and we had to do a creative writing project. And I decided to, and it had to involve A Wrinkle in Time, the novel. And so I decided to do like this crossover because Chrono Trigger was time travel. Wrinkle in Time was sort of like multiple worlds, right? And so it was the Chrono crew teleported to the Wrinkle in Time world, or vice versa.
Oh my gosh.
Off the top of my head which it was. And it was pretty cool. I was like 11. I was writing this. It was pretty sweet. It's pretty vivid in my memory. I stayed up all night doing it. So I was 11 or 12. And like, for some reason, my parents let me drink coffee to stay up all night doing this. I haven't asked them what they were thinking. I don't know what they were thinking.
I think that's the reason there are not as many 11-year-old novelists as usual. Yes, they don't have access to coffee.
Exactly. That's the key. But in any case, I finished it. Chrono Trigger Cross A Wrinkle in Time fanfic, handed it in, promptly went to the bathroom and like puked my guts up, and mom had to come pick me up. But I did it, and I was pretty proud of it. So there's just something there, I guess, about Chrono Trigger.
Oh, I hope you don't mind me sharing a little bit too, but I totally would have been the annoying classmate who didn't bust you to the teacher, but probably would have noticed that you were JRPG inspired, because that happened to me twice throughout school. One of my classmates basically kind of rewrote the plot of Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. And then later on, like, we were supposed to write a disaster story.
Did they rewrite Final Fantasy Mystic Quest again because it was a disaster?
No, that time it was Parasite Eve. Oh, okay. Which of course is based on a novel itself, which is funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. My first novel, like, that I wrote, like, fiction novel that I like really committed time to and wrote about half of, was like, it was Lunar, Silver Star Story, complete, like, sequel with the file numbers, like, or the serial number filed off. It was pretty transparent, but it taught me a lot, right? Fan fiction is great, and I think it's like such a creative realm. I was fortunate to, like, I don't know what it was, but like Japanese RPGs, I never ran into that thing where like they were like, you know, disrespected by teachers as not being like legitimate sources of story or inspiration. It was never like nerdy at my school to like Japanese RPGs. Like, all the cool older kids like them, and so I think that also kind of fed into it. Like, it was like this really kind of intense, positive like social watering hole
Oh, that's
for
great.
people at my school. Yeah, it was cool.
Is this the part where I have to mention that RPGFan used to be LunarNet
Is that right?
back in the day? Uh-huh.
Yep, that was our start.
Get out. That's really funny. Like I know LunarNet. How did that change? How did that, you guys, it just started covering more games, and I never made that connection before.
Yeah, I think over time we just kind of changed personnel and started covering more and evolved.
That's fantastic. I mean, the old working designs message boards were like one of my very first like kind of social interactions online with like the gaming community. And it's funny, I still, like I still see people, games writers and people in the press who like, used to post back then, way back, 2002 or whatever, 1999.
Well, let's actually talk a little bit about JRPG history, because we're not going to dive like all the way to the end, because you do cover from the very beginning up until modern day JRPGs. But you start off the book before video game RPGs. Actually, you start off talking about tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons, which the original Dungeons and Dragons it was not the refined experience that people would get today, but it was a foundation for the genre. And but more importantly for this book, D&D provided the template that many developers took and built it into computer RPGs with varying levels of success. So like the earliest days were like Ultima and Wizardry, which I guess would have been like the Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest of their day. That they had like a Pepsi and Coca-Cola type rivalry going on.
And one other thing I wanted to say, based on your idea about kind of a personal story and all the writers and creators who have in turn been inspired by JRPGs, it's a super interesting cycle, because as we're going to talk about, so many JRPGs were in turn inspired by these like early PC games.
Yeah.
And I mean, all of this was happening in the United States. Now, the question I have for you is, what brought RPGs to Japan? Specifically, what brought them to Japanese consoles?
Yeah, so games like you bring up Ultima and Wizardry, and I think they're like sort of the examples of successful transitions of like that D&D idea, right? Of bringing
the first CRPGs.
The CRPGs, right? And they were really good, and they were really popular in the West, but they also took off in Japan. So there were a lot of fans of Wizardry and Ultima, and they're kind of interesting because, like you say, they're like sort of the Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest of CRPGs, but they're very different, right? Wizardry is a first-person dungeon crawler. Ultima is something very different. It's more wide-ranging, whereas Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest are very similar. So they draw on these games. Yeah, they share a lot. But basically, like both of the creators of those games, Yuji Horii and Hironobu Sakaguchi, neither of them grew up expecting to make video games, right? So Sakaguchi wanted to be a musician. Horii wanted to be a manga artist. And so they pursued that a little bit. But they got to a point where for both of them, they wanted to, build those careers or, support them in some way. And that led them both to getting computers that ostensibly they were going to do work on. Horii was going to do, writing work because he was sort of becoming a writer while he was at university. I can't remember exactly what Sakaguchi was going to use his for, but they obviously just used them to play video games. And
like most artists do, when
all artists do. Yes,
quote unquote work machine.
Exactly. So, they started playing these games, Wizardry and Ultima in particular, really inspired them. And there were other Japanese developers who were trying to bring that idea of bringing these Western CRPGs to Japan, but on computers, right? They were making PC games, trying to emulate the Dungeons and Dragons experience, but again, on PC. And with the NES coming out, Yuji Horii and then Sakaguchi a bit after him said, no, let's do this for living rooms. How do I bring this Dungeons and Dragons experience to living rooms? And I think both of them were probably in part inspired sort of by the creative limitation of like game consoles and the sacrifices that kind of went into that, because somebody
especially
like
at the time,
Yuji Horii, at the time, absolutely at the time, Yuji Horii previously, he had created sort of like a point and click adventure detective game called the Portopia Serial Murder Mystery or something like that. I can't remember the exact name off the top of my head, but he created it for PCs and it was a pretty big hit. And then he wanted to bring it to the NES, but like he didn't have a mouse, right? There was no ability to do like a text parser. So in the original PC version, you would type in with a keyboard what you wanted to do, pick up, fork, take pot. But you couldn't do that on the NES. So he rebuilt the text parser into like this dialogue tree, basically, as we know it now. And I think that creative limitation, the idea of like, let's take this very complex genre that's like, growing in the computer world and bring it into the simpler, more confined, like living room space. And they both took that on. And Dragon Quest came out first. Final Fantasy came out second. And in many ways, they were very similar. Dragon Quest had one main character. Final Fantasy had four. There was a bit, there was some give and take. Final Fantasy had a darker tone. Dragon Quest was, even at that time, quite light and airy and heroic.
Yeah, Dragon Quest was pretty much inspired by European style fantasy, whereas Final Fantasy had some sci-fi elements, things like that.
Right from the bat, it drew in that sci-fi. And even like they went out and they both got these sort of like high-end artists, right? Like
I was just about to say that. Yep.
Yeah. The NES could obviously not produce like images even close to the concept art, but they brought in Akira Toriyama, who Horii kind of worked with at Shonen Jump. And he's known for Dragon Ball. They brought him in to do like all the box art and the character art and the concept art for Dragon Quest. And he has his very, like iconic, bright, cartoony style. And then Final Fantasy brought in an artist with a very different style. They brought in Amano, who has this very like ethereal, like otherworldly, like watercolory style that's just as identifiable, just as unique as what Toriyama was doing at the time, but very, very different. And you can see off the bat that, they had these same root inspirations, but even at that like very first game, even if like the main template was the same, they had different ideas of where they needed to go and where the genre could go. And I think we've seen that bear out because now those series are very, very different.
They're very different
Final
places
Fantasy
nowadays.
15 and Dragon Quest 11 they're both RPGs, but they're very, very different gameplay experiences. And I think you can take that right back to those early days of those two creators, like neither of which planned to become video game creators, but both, ended up defining a genre through their different interpretations of like what it meant to play Dungeons and Dragons on your living room television. And
this was all on the Nintendo Entertainment System, but there were other consoles in Japan, and of course, the one that I think most people would think of for the 8-bit and 16-bit eras would be Sega. Yeah. And Nintendo clearly had the edge when it came to JRPGs, especially in this time. But Sega also brought forward a classic of the genre, Phantasy Star, which went in a very different direction than both. Like, I guess Final Fantasy would have split the difference between fantasy and sci-fi, and Phantasy Star went the rest of the distance. So it was science fiction with fantasy elements.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to see, like, what Reiko Kodama and Yuji Naka and that team at Sega were able to accomplish, because, their mission was basically like, oh, okay, Square's making these games, these RPGs, Square and Enix, we can do that. We can do that in-house. We don't need to hire a developer. Like, we'll do that at Sega. And so they came up with this idea. And I think what's really unique about Phantasy Star is the way it was driven by a team with many women from the very get-go. And so that gave it like, something that I think Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest didn't have, in terms of like not necessarily making it better, but giving it that leg up, because it had a different identity, and it from the very beginning had different goals. It had a female protagonist from the get-go, and that was something that was really really helped set it apart from the other two. It brought in the first person dungeon crawling style dungeons from Wizardry, which neither the other two games had. And then the science fiction setting was super compelling and gave it variety, and gave it this story that was recognizable to the other side of sort of that science fiction and fantasy crowd, right? There are many people who only like science fiction or only like fantasy, but there's so many people who like them both. And so for Sega to recognize that they could take that template, that foundation that Sakaguchi and Horii created, and give it to this like really vibrant young team of creators, I think was a really bold move, and I think it paid off. And I think the stuff that Phantasy Star added to the ecosystem and showed just how far you can push JRPGs, because the other two were, Final Fantasy had science fiction elements, but that was only clear if you actually played the game. From the outside, it looked like a very traditional fantasy RPG. Phantasy Star was not that. And I think it's still a niche that like isn't explored enough in current JRPGs. You have stuff like Xenoblade Chronicles. It's fairly sci-fi.
And if you're looking at retro style games, Cosmic Star Heroine obviously pulled a lot of inspiration from it.
Yes, absolutely. That's a good example. And then another team at the same time, it was on the NES, not Sega, but the work that Shigesato Itoi was doing on Earthbound was interesting because that was taking the idea and twisting the setting. And how does an RPG change if it's in a fantasy world, or it's in a science fiction world, or it's in everyday world? Like, how does that change? All the mechanics were very similar, but the experiences were very different because the creators, Sakaguchi and Horii and Kodama and Yuji Naka and Itoi, all had different desires and different stories they wanted to tell. And I think that from the very get-go set up a genre that was exploratory and wanted to push kind of narrative and world building boundaries and create something that was like, always unique and always trying to pull in lots of different ideas.
Yeah, it really helped in this time period too that Japan had JRPG fever. Like, it was an astoundingly popular genre of video game. And there were always the stories about like how Dragon Quest couldn't be sold on a school day because kids would skip school, or people would skip work to get their hands on it. So it was incredibly popular. But interestingly, this popularity didn't automatically transfer over to the West. So let's talk a little bit about what brought JRPGs to the West, and how were these games initially received by a Western audience?
Yeah, so I mean, the original Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest both came out in the West. Dragon Quest was called Dragon Warrior at the time because of like a rights issue. Yeah. They did okay. Dragon Quest, Dragon Warrior was, it took a lot of effort. They were giving it away for free. Like, they couldn't sell it at first, so they're giving it away for free with Nintendo Power subscriptions, right? And so you subscribed to the magazine, you got Dragon Warrior. And so like, that sort of brute forced the game into a ton of living rooms, right?
Oh yeah, it's almost a similar strategy as to attaching like Sonic the Hedgehog to the Genesis, or like putting Super Mario Brothers releasing, but like it's such a great value. Like, how could you not possibly take it?
Yeah, exactly. And that version that came to the West had some like gameplay improvements and stuff like that, graphical improvements. So it was like slightly better than Japanese version. Final Fantasy was the same. It did pretty good. Didn't light the world on fire though. And I think at that time, American gamers, Western gamers in Canada and elsewhere in the West weren't quite looking for that style of game. And I don't know if that was just like we were all a bit younger at that time. I don't know about like the demographics of who was into video games at the time. But like I said, like the first time I saw Japanese RPGs on the Game Boy, I thought it was like slow and plodding and weird. Like, I really needed that sort of like more frantic action of like a side scroller, like Fall of the Foot Clan. But, they kept trying, and we did get, some more Japanese RPGs, but we also started to miss some. Like Itoi's Mother didn't come out in the West, right? We didn't get Final Fantasy 2 or 3. And so after Final Fantasy 1 came out in the West, Square skipped then the other NES ones. They were coming out like quite fast as well. So there was also a weird like timeline thing where by the time Final Fantasy was getting to the West, like Japan was already a game or two ahead.
Oh yeah, they just had an incredible backlog of games that they could localize. So they really had to cherry pick what they would bring over.
Exactly. And like Square wasn't, like Final Fantasy was a hit for them in Japan, and like, whether it saved the company or not, like whether that's true, I don't know for sure, but they weren't the Square Enix of today, right? They still had to make kind of savvy business decisions about these sorts of things, and they had to find a publisher who's willing to, publish them in the West. And so, as the NES era sort of started rounding out and finishing up, there was the Super Nintendo was coming out, and I think that's what most Western players would sort of identify as like the first golden age of the genre. I think most, or like many at least, would look back at that and be like, yeah, okay, the NES ones were like cool in concept and theory, But the Super Nintendo took that idea, took the template that was created for the NES and like really polished it up, right? And by the end of the Super Nintendo, you had games like, you know, Chrono Trigger. You had Phantasy Star 4 on the Genesis, which came out in like quite late, like 1995 or something like that.
Mhm.
And they were just like really, really good versions of what Sakaguchi and Horii and Kodama initially dreamed up at the beginning of the NES's life cycle. You know, they were so recognizably the same type of game.
Absolutely. And the amazing thing about it is that these games had started building an audience. Obviously, I mean, these like Final Fantasy, Chrono Trigger were getting features on the front covers of gaming magazines. So people knew about them, even if they were not close to as popular as other games. But what I find very interesting is in terms of, let's say, in terms of games that really broke into the public consciousness and expanded the popularity of JRPGs, despite the fact that the golden age was on the Super Nintendo, it wasn't the Super Nintendo and it wasn't the Genesis that I think had the biggest impact on how the public perceived RPGs. It was the Game Boy.
Yes. Yeah.
And the reason why is, I mean, got to catch them all, Pokemon.
Yeah, absolutely. And Pokemon came to the West after probably the other big inflection point, or not probably, but the other big inflection point, which was Final Fantasy VII, right?
Yes.
So you had Final Fantasy VII in 1997, and then you had Pokemon in 1999. And those two are the two titles that you can look at as like the catalysts for growth of JRPGs in the West. And it's funny because like going all the way back to the very beginning of the Super Nintendo, like Square knew there was potential. They understood that like fundamentally. I think Horii and Enix were a little more like bearish on the Western markets. And they were very focused on Japan, but Square knew that there was this potential. They just went about seizing it in the wrong way. And so like Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy II came out. And again, like it kind of fell into that niche. It was, you know, it was pretty popular. It sold pretty well, but it was also kind of clear throughout the Super NES's lifespan that there were about 400 to 600,000 JRPG fans. Like that's where you were going to cap out at sales. They're like, it's consistent across almost all titles, right? And so like a JRPG could sort of like be like, okay, we'll make this, we'll release it in the West, we'll sell 400 to 600,000 units because JRPG fans were starved for games and they would buy everything. And there was 500,000 of them.
True, but there was also a tremendous cost in terms of not just time that needs to go into them, but also designers. Like these are not easy games. These are not a simple side scroller.
Yeah, exactly. They're exponentially larger than other games. So what Square did in the early 90s was they started trying to create games specifically for Western audiences. So they made Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy II easier for the West. They created Final Fantasy Mystic Quest like specifically for the West. And it's like, you know, you guys laugh because it's like, it's a relic. It's interesting to play, but like it was so fundamentally not what sprung Japanese RPGs in the West.
Yeah, Mystic Quest is a branch of the RPG tree that just stopped dead. It never continued.
Yeah. It was clear like that these Japanese creators thought that the reason Japanese RPGs weren't taking off was because like Westerners were too dumb or were intimidated by complex systems or stories.
Well, there was clearly a lot of cultural bias there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it was just a misread of the Western like society and culture and needs and wants, right? I think maybe the West also needed to mature a little bit, like literally like age up a little bit. Because like, you know, by the time in 1997, Final Fantasy VII hits, you know, it sold something like 10 million units instead of like 500,000 units, right? It blew up. And I think part of that is because the kids like us who were playing simpler JRPGs when we were younger, we needed to like Final Fantasy VII would have gone way over my head if I was 9 years old, right? But by the time I was like 14 or 15, it was exactly what I needed. And so I think it was also like, there was timing in there, right? They had to wait for that moment to pounce. Once the kids who associated JRPGs and had played them for years as kids grew up into like teenagers who sort of like started to get into anime, right? Like this is the same time when like stuff like Akira and Ninja Scroll and Dragon Ball Z, like all of those were on my radar as well. And I think for a lot of people, and so like, you know, they jump on that with Final Fantasy VII and like, I don't know how or why they knew they should commit like $30 million or $40 million to marketing this game, like just an obscene amount of money. I think that's how much it was. It was a lot, but they did. and it worked, and it ended up selling 10 million units, right? And then the next year, Xenogears comes out, and like Xenogears is a game that, like, you know, it's kind of old and still kind of weird and kludgy, and it's super long, and it's about, you know, religious allegory. Like, it's weird, right?
And then there's the final disc.
Yeah, well, I'll defend the final disc, like,
Oh, I know,
to the end, but yeah, like, it's weird, right? But it still sold 1 million units, right? And so, like, all of a sudden, there was this like market for JRPGs that had expanded quite a bit. You know, there were Final Fantasy fans who would buy multiple millions of units of those games. And then, like, again, like, even like Square sort of like smaller or like lower profile games like Saga Frontier or Xenogears could all of a sudden sell 1 million units. And so that kind of started that ball rolling. But then Pokemon comes along, and that leapt outside of that sort of like teenage, early 20s crowd that I think was really driving JRPGs with Final Fantasy VII's success. And all of a sudden, this was something that, you know, kids could get into. And it was something that parents wanted to get for their kids. Like, a Game Boy, I think, felt safe. You could give your kid a Game Boy, and, you know, they spent all this time as an RPG. They were reading. It was like, you know, something they were really into. And as a kid, you know, I was a teenager by the time Pokemon Red and Blue came out, but like, having this like portable adventure in my hands was like, you know, you get lost in that little screen. And I, you know, like, driving around in the back of my parents' van as we were going wherever, going shopping, like, lost in this, like, all of a sudden, you know, like, being able to take these adventures on the go and reaching an audience that like loved JRPGs, but also like kids who are into the anime and into that whole thing was like just a brilliant move by Nintendo to jump on that marketing opportunity. And my friend Dan Dockery has written a book, comes out the same day as mine, so October 4th, from the same publisher, and it's called Monster Kids, and it looks at Pokemon and that success, and then everything it sort of like spawned, and the, you know, the coming of Digimon and Yu-Gi-Oh, and looking at that phenomenon of how it brought Japanese culture over to the West alongside like other more, you know, air quotes, mature Japanese RPGs like Final Fantasy.
I also think that this might not be giving parents and adults of that generation enough credit, but I don't care. This has been my personal theory, which is, I think a lot of the resistance to the NES, the Super Nintendo, the Genesis back in those days is because kids were in front of a TV. And there was a lot of demonization in those days about kids are spending too much time in front of the TV. They should be going outside. They should be playing. They should be doing it. Like, the idea of sitting in front of a TV and watching things was very demonized. And
right. It's passive. It's not active enough.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that also extended over to video games, because while they were still doing something, they were doing something active, they were still sitting in front of the idiot box.
Yeah.
Whereas the Game Boy didn't quite have that stigma attached to it, because I don't think that a lot of adults at the time saw the screen of the Game Boy as a television set.
Yeah.
I think it almost got around that, because a lot of parents at the time, I mean, my Game Boy was constantly being taken by my parents to play Tetris and other games like this.
Can I like let you guys in on like this crazy theory I have
Please.
about like video games and exactly what you're talking about? So like, my parents were both you know, tech friendly. Like, my dad, I've had computers my whole life. There's pictures of me and my brothers as babies playing on like a Commodore 64. It's always been part of my life. My dad's an early adopter, still is. And my mom always liked games too. And I'm pretty sure I got a Game Boy because my mom wanted to play Tetris and there was a Star Trek game, right? I mean, like, I'm older now than my mom was when I would have got my Game Boy, right? And I love video games. I write about them. I play them all the time, you know? So like, you know, as our parents were in their late 20s and 30s, like they still have that mentality of wanting to play. I have this theory that when you're in your 30s, you also can't comfortably sit like 3 feet in front of the TV for extended periods of time, cross-legged on the floor. And like, I've always had this kind of like suspicion that part of the reason that like that generation of parents couldn't get into video games, console games, and why they were considered kids' toys is because like, you had the console, you had a controller with a 3-foot cord. And so the
you
only
couldn't
way
sit
to
on the
play
couch.
you couldn't sit on the couch. You had to sit on the floor in front of the TV, right? And parents can't do that. I wouldn't really enjoy sitting on the floor 3 feet from my TV, though I do it sometimes because I have a Super Nintendo with little cords. And I feel like the Game Boy broke that down in exactly the way that you're describing, is that all of a sudden it was something they could just hold in their hands. You know, like I can picture my mom curled up in our big armchair under the lamp playing Tetris. Right. She
absolutely.
couldn't do that with the other game consoles. And I think that kind of freeing of video games from the TV, you know, like, because then you could watch, you know, the hockey game, and it didn't mean kicking somebody off playing video games. Right. And I think all of those things kind of came together to kind of help video games kind of become, like you say, like there was something different about playing on a dedicated device like that. And I think that absolutely helped Pokemon take off.
I think you see the same mentality take off when the iPhone actually started to break through again.
Yeah.
It eliminated that space. All of a sudden it was in the palm of your hand.
Yeah.
And that was the explosion of casual gaming back about 10 years ago. And
now that, like, that demographic, like my parents who are in their 60s now, like that demographic with like smartphones and stuff, like, is a huge demographic of smartphone user. Like they adopted those. Like I would have never expected an adoption rate in, like, you know, older demographics in the way that it has, that everybody has a smartphone now and everybody uses it and everybody's on Instagram. Like, you know, like that is really interesting, that you kind of make that personal connection and it changes the way people think about these things.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that was one of the major reasons why the internet broke through. I mean, the internet was very popular, obviously, but it's what Steve Jobs said, which was, it's the internet in the palm of your hand.
Yes.
All of a sudden, any barriers to entry that could have ever existed were gone.
Yes.
And it was easy. Right there. And it was the same thing with the Game Boy.
Yeah. You just picked it up and turned it on. Your game was right there. Right.
Bam.
Yeah. And the games were also designed to be played in these small chunks and in this way, right? Like Tetris was so easy to pick up. You play 2 rounds and you put it down, and it doesn't matter that it doesn't save your game, right? No, it doesn't matter. It's not Super Mario Brothers, where if you stop playing after 2 levels, you've lost all that progress, right? You could pick up Tetris, you could play 2 rounds, it would save your score and you're done. And I think that was also a really appealing entry point for people. And then that extends on, and then you get into Pokemon, which does have a really robust save system. And so you can kind of show, like, you know, like kids coming over and being like, hey mom, look, I caught this Pikachu and now it's level 22, you know, and I beat this gym. And you can see your kid sort of making that progress through a game in a way that's like pretty easy to understand. More so, I think, than, you know, like trying to explain Final Fantasy VII's plot to your mom and dad, right? Like
trying to explain Final Fantasy VII plot to yourself is difficult enough.
Yeah.
And okay, I'm going to tie everything all together now. You ready?
Excellent.
Yes.
And now we have Pokemon Go.
Oh,
which
yes.
has introduced a bunch of new people, but all these different generations can kind of play, and you can get Diglett in a fancy hat.
Yeah, absolutely. And like Pokemon Go is like, it brings like families together in that way, right? Because you're experiencing, and again, it's like that shared experience of like, you're both holding the phone, you're both looking at the map, you're strategizing where to go, you're in the battles and stuff together.
You raid, yeah,
it's cool. And then like the community aspects of it with, like, you know, raids and gyms and all that kind of stuff is interesting as well. Like taking that community aspect that Pokemon's always had. And of course, like the tradability, the trading aspect, the combat aspect, like, you know, the bragging aspect, the brilliant idea to have 2 versions with like different Pokemon. So that great. On the schoolyard, like, you know, you're having to seek out somebody who had the different colored cart. Like there were a lot of like very, very clever marketing decisions that took this, like, you know, sort of game that looked on the surface like a fairly casual JRPG experience and created something that was like much more complex in terms of like the social nuance and the way people interacted with their game and thought about their game, thought about the items and the creatures, the Pokemon that they had in the game.
Well, let's continue on with this, because I mean, there's a lot we could talk about here in terms of your history and the history of JRPGs. But since we're on the topic of handhelds, Part 5 of your book, there's multiple parts of your book that are divided into like different eras. One of them is the dark years. And there were RPGs being released on these consoles, but a part of the problem was the barrier to entry for developers suddenly got a whole lot higher when you released HD consoles, and all of a sudden details were very important. You needed to be able to make your game look good in HD. And that did discourage a number of developers. Thankfully, JRPGs found another home, which is exactly what we were talking about, which is, I would argue, during this period, handheld RPGs on the Game Boy Advance, the DS, things like that, exploded in popularity.
I think there's two things going on here, three maybe. So the first one is what you described, like developers, and especially Japanese developers, who like they really like to like create the new engines for every game. They like to do everything in house. They were wary of at that point of third party stuff, like and bringing in different engines,
and they still are.
They still are, sure. But they're doing it more. And that's partly, you can pinpoint that partly on Hironobu Sakaguchi again and his company Mistwalker, who was one of the first like Japanese RPG developers to go and partner with Unreal Engine and use it in some of his games. But for the most part, they were having a lot of trouble transitioning to these HD consoles. And so like the living room experience of sitting down in front of your TV and playing a JRPG was pretty few and far between. And even the ones that existed, like Xenoblade Chronicles, took a lot of like fan effort to get over to the West.
Rainfall, yeah.
Yeah, Operation Rainfall, which
you actually focus on quite a bit in this book.
Yeah,
it's a fascinating chapter.
I could have, honestly, I could write a whole book on that experience. It's incredible.
I enjoyed your takeaway at the end of it, which was the same takeaway I had, which was it may have changed history. Or it may have done absolutely nothing. We'll never know.
Nobody will say, right? Like there's nothing on record that actually says like, oh yeah, this is why Xenoblade came over. But like I'm playing through Xenoblade Chronicles 3 right now. And if you ask me, like my personal opinion is that we would not be playing Xenoblade Chronicles 3 right now if it wasn't for a bunch of people on an IGN message board like 12 years ago. Which is like just wild to me. And I think it's a fascinating story. But that's what we had to go through to get Japanese RPGs during this period, which was like, dark years for Japanese games. But one of the chapters in that section is called A Light in the Darkness, and it focuses on this transition to handheld gaming,
which is pretty funny considering how friggin' dim the Game Boy Advance screen was.
Well, yes, I know they improved it pretty quick, and the PSP was pretty cool, but yeah, like
a barely visible light in the dark.
Yes, yeah, like if you squint, I mean the first one didn't even have a light at all. But what I think is like, I think there's two things that were going on there, and the first one was, again, I think if we look at the age of the people who were like playing the JRPGs in the 90s, like when they first started to like really popularize, and they were teenagers when Final Fantasy VII and stuff came out. By the time the HD era came and they started drifting away from consoles onto handhelds, people like me, I was in my 20s and I was working, so I was commuting a lot. I still lived on an island and I was traveling over by ferry like almost every day and spending an hour on the ferry every day. I was driving to work. I was like on the go a lot. So even if I had wanted to play games on my TV, I wouldn't have had that time or that space or that opportunity. And I think a lot of people were going through similar life changes where they weren't necessarily at home all the time. We had growing social lives, or we had more work, or we were at university, and handheld gaming fits into that really nicely because it can be on the go and it can happen when it's convenient. And I think that was happening for a lot of people, right? Like the people who are now in their 30s and 40s, like late 30s, maybe early 40s, like they're the ones sort of making Japanese RPGs now, and they were the ones that were in university in their 20s with a Game Boy Advance or a DS. And so I think that was happening. So there was a big audience. Like the audience for Japanese RPGs was also moving towards handheld systems. But I also think, like going back to what you said earlier, the lower like overhead for creating an RPG for those systems was much, much lower. It was cheaper and there was less risk, right? And I think, again, and to go back even further, there were those like creative boundaries that I think inspire a lot of people. Like the HD consoles, I think that's in some ways companies like Square Enix got too caught up in the possibilities and too caught up in the idea that they had to do something like totally overly like mind-blowing on these HD consoles, and that created sort of a form of paralysis. But if you go back to like the PlayStation before Final Fantasy VII came out, and even after Final Fantasy VII came out, a lot of the great RPGs on that system still look like and feel like and are in the mold of Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis RPGs, right? Like Wild Arms and Xenogears and Breath of Fire 3 and 4, like those all use the same shape, and the same ideas, the same like design philosophies as 16-bit RPGs. They fall into that same realm, but they didn't do that on HD consoles. They wanted to create something that was just like felt modern, felt like an HD game. But the Game Boy and the DS and the PSP offered restrictions, like, you know, an environment that was defined and had an upper limit. And you could design
constraints
within
facilitate
that.
creativity. That's just
Exactly.
a reality.
And I think that that's why we saw such an explosion of like really interesting games, because they were easier to make. The restrictions were clear, and that created an environment that really drove creativity to define the games rather than technology defining the games.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, we got a lot of ports of older games. We got a lot of reimaginings of older games. Like right now I'm looking at Lunar Legend for the GBA. It's the cart's right in front of me. And that was like, you know, they couldn't do Lunar Silver Star Story Complete on the Game Boy Advance. So they like reimagined it in this portable version of the game. And is it as good as the console version? Like, not really, but it exists, right? And they would never would have done that. They never could have done a similar thing on one of the HD consoles. And so I think like that confluence of the genre on handhelds just came together because it was a comfortable development environment. The games were cheap, and so risks came with less, you know, potential for loss. So if something didn't hit, that, you know, didn't sink you in the same way that missing out on the HD consoles might have. And then, you know, just like kind of overthinking things a bit on the HD consoles. Like I think the best JRPGs of that era, like Lost Odyssey and Blue Dragon, Tales of Vesperia, Tales of Symphonia, like those are all fairly straightforward JRPGs, right? Baten Kaitos, I get, are those are Baten Kaitos and Symphonia, I guess, are the generation before.
But I still take your point, yes.
But like the point is, yeah, like during that era, those HD, the best of the best HD JRPGs were sort of very traditional.
The days where Square could lock a 20-person team in a room for a year and they'd pop out with an RPG, those were long gone on consoles.
Yeah, absolutely. But they could exist on handhelds, right?
Yeah.
And I think that Square and Japanese developers knew how to make games like that, right? And now, you know, now I think we're still seeing the effects of the HD era. I mean, we only just got out from the like the shadow of Final Fantasy 13's like extended you know, series that started life on the PS2 and then eventually finished sort of like on the PS4.
The hallway that lasted 3 generations.
Yeah. And they just like, yeah, exactly. And I think they just galaxy brained themselves into too big of ideas and got paralyzed by that. But now look at where we're going now, right? We see Final Fantasy 16 and it's like, it's going off in this one direction. Like Yoshi P is talking about how they're going to do like an action oriented, almost like a character action game style combat system because they want to pull in that younger audience, right? But then you also have like the Suikoden HD remaster, which looks amazing. And you have stuff like Sea of Stars, which I think we mentioned earlier, and Ayuden Chronicles, which are like much more traditional, like pixel art based JRPGs that like really appeal to people in a different way. And so now like, I think we're sort of diversifying what we feel and understand JRPGs can be. They can be big and inventive, like what Final Fantasy wants to do, to success sometimes and to kind of weird failure in other times, or they can go along that sort of more traditional path and still have value and still appeal to a wide audience.
Where you end up with Dragon Quest XI, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I think it's worth saying that Ayuden's not alone, because Arm Fantasia and Pennyblood just got funded as well.
Yes. That's a fabulous example of how you can take these sort of like established ideas and like they are gorgeous games, right? Like they don't skimp on like visuals. It's not like you have to make something that looks cheap
or music
or anything, right? Like they look like really robust experiences, and I'm thrilled that they exist. And I don't even think a company like Square would have like had the guts to make something like that, you know, at the start of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 area, right? They probably could have, and they probably could have made something that came out better than Final Fantasy 13. But what happened is we got to this place where gaming and the gaming like industry is changing so much that it's driving people to indie solutions and Kickstarters. And we're seeing stuff like Ayuden Chronicle and other Kickstarters from indie developers showing that this audience is here and they're hungry for these like, you know, really recognizable sort of traditional JRPG experiences it doesn't have to be Final Fantasy 16, right? Which is trying to like blow every, you know, like wall off the glass building to wow everybody. Like these are games that like really hone in on what we've always loved about the genre, and there's that audience for it. So now we're also seeing Square, put out stuff like Octopath Traveler and Octopath Traveler 2, the HD 2D games. We're seeing Konami return to Suikoden. Like, I never thought that was ever in a million years going to happen. But Live Alive, yeah. I never thought that would happen, but like, we have this robust indie scene, and the ability for fan communities to support these projects has shown, like, sort of the more corporate side of the industry, that like, oh yeah, there are people here that want this type of experience. It doesn't have to always be this weird, like, galaxy brain idea.
And then occasionally you get something like Final Fantasy 14, Realm Reborn, which I really enjoyed the little chapter on that in your book.
I had so much fun writing that chapter. It, like, again, if you're talking about something that could be a book on its own, like Final Fantasy 14, it could be like a series of books. It's fascinating. And I think it's such a like wonderful example of how much the genre has grown and evolved. And earlier you brought up the fact that, like, there's all this inspiration and the way that games inspire each other. And I think Final Fantasy 14 is a really good example of how the original games were Japanese created games inspired by Western ideas, right? And then we come forward to Final Fantasy 14, and it's this very Western game idea once again, like the MMORPG, once again, sort of like taken by, Japanese developers and introduced it together and brought together in a way that's so compelling and has found immense success. And I love that kind of cyclical story of how the Western and Japanese kind of game design ideas and philosophies inspire one another over and over, and kind of have that, cyclical dance where they're ebbing and flowing and inspiring one another over and over and over again.
And that will just continue.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great. And now we keep talking about like Sea of Stars, and another good example is a game called Quartet from Something Classic. And these are like indie RPGs. They don't want to call themselves Japanese RPGs because they're not, Japanese, but they're like very clearly like Western games inspired by Japanese creators and Japanese games. And I think that that's really cool as well.
I agree. And this kind of inspiration that, these games have brought these new creators, I mean, it will just continue and continue and continue, because, well, we were talking a little bit about constraints and technological constraints and things like that. And there is another side of that, which is the technology has reached the point now where the ability to create very complex and polished games are now in the hands of developers, specifically indie developers, and they're creating experiences that are easily the equal of anything that the massive companies, Square, Enix, variety of others, created back in the 90s.
One of the like most interesting things and stories I've written over the past few years is a look at how like fan communities are not just creating new things, but in this specific case, going back to like some of the old classic JRPGs like Final Fantasy IX, and bringing them back to life in a way that like far exceeds what the like billion-dollar corporations are doing. And in Final Fantasy IX's specific case, there's a mod called Moguri mod that uses AI to upscale backgrounds, and it does all this amazing stuff. And you load it on top of the Steam version, and it feels like this modern, revitalized version of Final Fantasy IX. It feels like what you remember Final Fantasy IX looking like. And this is like a group of fans, and like, some of them are professionals in the game industry, but they're working as fans, and they're showing that like it takes ingenuity and it takes robust tools, like you're saying, but it doesn't have to take a ton of money, right, to like to apply some of these ideas to games. And you have other smaller studios who are using Kickstarter funded models to create games that, in my opinion, look just as exciting as anything like Square or, like similar companies are putting out, right? Like if you ask me right now, like Ayuden Chronicle and Sea of Stars and the Wild Arms and Shadow Hearts games, I can never remember their names. Penny something?
Penny Blood, yep.
Yeah, Penny Blood. They look incredible, right? And like they're not sacrificing depth, but they've chosen art styles, they've chosen structures that fit into the kind of creative constraints that they've put upon themselves. Nowadays, you can do anything you want. You're not constrained by the technology in the way that they were 20 years ago. So now I think successful games are going to look for constraints, not just in technology, but constraints in sort of vision and scope creep, and come up with an idea that's super polished, super strong, and doesn't try to do too much, and focuses on being really, really good at what it wants to be. And I think that we're going to find that there's a ton of really interesting projects coming out over the next decade that aren't necessarily like blowing you away with scope. You know, they're blowing you away because they're like really polished, really well thought out, clever games from, maybe smaller studios even.
Well, speaking about scope creep, we're going to start winding this down because I know that you have to take care of your kids.
Yeah.
But I did want to ask you this. Scope creep is something that doesn't just affect, game developers. It also affects writers. And I think that what you have here is a very, very tightly written book. I think it flows. I don't think there's anything in this book that feels superfluous at all. However, as a review manager and a reviewer myself and a writer, I know how much can end up on the cutting room floor, some good, some not so good. I was just curious, in this book, what did you have to cut from it that you kind of wish that you could have kept in it?
Oh man. So the book is about 120,000 words long. I pitched it quite a bit shorter than that. So like my initial idea was to tell the story in about 70,000 words.
Wow.
I couldn't do that. But I did have a very, very strong outline. And so that helped me from the very get-go find and shape a narrative and like a narrative kind of through line in the book. That always the book it's a story, the history of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. And so I looked for games and topics and stories and people that tie back into one of those three core concepts. So it's either about like the history of Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest, or how they've impacted things and inspired future games, right? So looking at how games later in the book tie back to decisions that were made by Sakaguchi and Horii way back when, or stories about how these kind of sort of strange Japanese RPGs became so popular in the West. And so with those three things in mind, I created an outline that was I felt like pretty good. I felt like it had a good beginning, a middle, and an end. It kind of, starts with Yuji Horii and Sakaguchi. It ends right back at the beginning with an older Sakaguchi wondering if he's made his last game. I wrote the book. Sorry, I said it was 120,000 words. It's 110. The first draft was 125,000 words. So I cut about 15%. So 15,000 words or so from the draft that I had actually written. Some of that was full chapters. Like I just, I wrote some pretty great content and pretty great chapters that just didn't fit into that overall narrative arc. And when you talk about like fluff or superfluous, it would have felt like that. And so, I was able to repurpose those in other places in the book. Some of it came out wholesale. Some of it, I've held on to the material so that I can tell those stories in a different fashion, in a different medium. And so that was hard. Some stuff I just didn't get to write at all because I knew from the get-go that it wasn't going to fit. I would have loved to write a story about the Sega Saturn. Like it's an incredible Japanese RPG system. Like it has so many amazing, interesting, unique Japanese RPGs, and it has the best version of a bunch of Japanese RPGs like Grandia, like Lunar, Silver Star Story Complete. Like it's such a great system, just not in the West. Right. It has almost nothing to offer Japanese RPGs in the West. It's a novelty. And so I would have loved to spend 5,000 words digging into the Sega Saturn. But it just didn't fit like the overall narrative arc that I was talking about. And so that's something that I want to pursue. Like I still want to tell that story, and I still will.
I mean, everything about Sega from like the last year of the Genesis up until the end of the Dreamcast is just fascinating.
I mean, again, you're talking about a whole book, like something that could fill a whole book, like that kind of rise and fall of Sega and how much like of that was kind of hubris, like that's just fascinating. Right. And the Saturn is like such a like self-created like failure on Sega's part. I would have loved to have had that in the book. It was in the original outline. I kept it as long as I could. I would have loved to have gone into more games that I feel really interesting, like niches in Japanese RPG history, but I couldn't find the way that they sort of impacted the series or the genre's success in the West in a way that felt like it was,
serving your narrative.
Filling that narrative, right? That it fit into the book's core narrative of like Sakaguchi, Dragon Quest, Horii, and Final Fantasy. or the other way
Yeah.
around, and the rise of the genre in the West. So I would have loved to have, written a bunch about the Tales of series. I think they're really interesting. They're popular, but it just didn't really fit into the book. Same with like the Trails in the Sky series, which I'm constantly fascinated with, and the Legend of Heroes, like overarching series. So I would have loved to have written about those books, but it just wasn't in the the cards for this book. It had to end at some point, and
Yes.
I couldn't have handed it in at 200,000 words.
Well,
Unfortunately.
I mean, to be honest, these are all interesting topics, and these are things that you might be able to explore in future books.
Yeah.
Things are looking pretty good for the video game book publishing industry. I mean, a brand new imprint was just announced today, I believe. We're recording this on the 30th. Limited Run Games just announced Press Run for video games. It's led by Jeremy Parrish and Jared Petty. Jeremy Parrish, best known from, I would say, the NES Works books and YouTube videos. So it looks like this is a growth industry, and I honestly think that you have a heck of an entry here. It's a very engaging book. I read it cover to cover, enjoyed it, related to it hard, especially the sections where you expanded on your personal experiences with the genre. So I'm very thankful that we got a copy of this and that we got to talk to you about this today.
Thanks. I really appreciate that. I'm really excited for Print Run. Like you bring up Jeremy. He's somebody, I think I mentioned the Working Designs message boards back in like 1999. And I remember him like way back then posting on those boards. And there's few people in the games industry that I would trust with its, to take care of its history and its people and its stories as much as I would trust Jeremy Parrish with that. And so to have an imprint that's focused on that story, bringing forward this history, and not just like, not just a good readable way, but a beautiful way, because Limited Run has that attention to detail when it comes to art and just the whole experience of having a book. And it just makes me happy to see that there's going to be more books about video games, and not just video games, but like, people and history and story and community around video games, because I think there's so many fascinating stories that still remain to be told. And I hope to keep telling them, it's been so gratifying working on this book, but not just that, like you reach the point where you're working on a project. And I wrote this book quite fast. Like the whole experience of writing the first draft was about 3.5 months, which was pretty quick.
Oh, that is fast for 100,000 words.
Yeah, it was a lot. But you lose, like in the middle of that, you lose track of, the perspective on the book. And so it's been so gratifying talking to people like the two of you and hearing, the experience you've had, and that, the goals that I had for the book have come forward. And I really hope to get to share more of those in the future. So I appreciate you having me on tonight and chatting about the book, reading it, and sharing that with everybody.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Looking forward to drafting the review as well. And like you mentioned, I think we're at a really exciting time where we've been following RPGs long enough that people are starting to really kind of consider and write about the cultural impact that they've had, and start to view the industry from that perspective. And I think you have a great solid entry in that, and I can't wait to see what more comes of it.
Well, we've been jabbing long enough here. Let's sell some books. Aidan, why don't you tell us when the book is coming out and where people can buy it?
Sure. The book comes out October 4th. 2022 from Running Press, which is an imprint of Hachette, and it's going to be available in any bookstore. I generally try to push people towards their indie bookstores. It's excellent to support, independent booksellers in your town. If they don't have it on their shelves, they'll be able to order it in. And if we're lucky, they'll order 2 or 3 copies alongside the one that you want. If you can't, you get online, you can go to, anywhere you want online is going to have it. Any of your big box bookstores will have it. And again, if it's not on shelves, they'll be able to get it in very quick and easy. I've also been doing signed pre-orders from an indie bookstore in Victoria, BC called Monroe's. But by the time this comes out, I will probably have been down there and signed stock. So I don't know if they'll still be selling signed copies, but that is a possibility. If there's demand there at Monroe's, I'm happy to drive back into Victoria and sign some more stock. So you can Google them, Monroe's Books in Victoria, BC.
Awesome. So yeah, just wherever you buy your books, or look up look them up online. And
I also built a website for the book, which has all this information, and that might be useful for readers to know. You can find it at fightmagicitems.rocks, ROCKS, Fight Magic Items Rocks. And it has information about the book, but it also has a big section with a bunch of links to various booksellers. And also, maybe most helpful is a site that will help you find indie bookstores in your region. And so you can, plunk in your region or your address, and it'll show you all the indie bookstores in your area. And so
that's a pretty handy tool regardless.
Yeah, it's cool.
I'd also like to say that really quickly that there are definitely some websites that help you purchase books online, but still through more local venues. So that's another good option.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, hope you don't mind, but we're also going to take an opportunity here to talk about our stuff. So speaking of stores, we have one here at RPGFan.com. You can find it at www.rpgfan.com/shop. We have t-shirts, mugs, all kinds of things, and we're coming out with some new stuff. So please take a look at that, and it's a fantastic way to support the site. A great way to support this podcast is to check out our past episodes. We have many, many past episodes, including some other episodes of Random Book Club. We are not the only podcast here at RPG Fan, though. We also have Retro Encounter with Mr. Mike Solosi. That's focusing on some retro games. We have lots of other interesting episodes coming out, including a series of episodes that Hilary and I are going to be on together coming out next month. So really excited about that.
It's Adventure Game Month.
It's Adventure Game Month. Yeah, so we're playing some adventure games, which, I'm just super excited. So crepes, I've really actually got to get on playing the next one because we're recording on Monday and I haven't started it yet. We also have Rhythm Encounter, which is RPG Fan's music podcast. Last week was focusing on, in honor of the Kickstarter, we were focusing on the music of Wild Arms and Shadow Hearts. It was called Wild Hearts and Shadow Arms or something like that, Hill?
Yeah, it was our Wild Hearts episode.
Yes. And what's coming up next week, Hill?
So we've got a few exciting things. Our next episode is going to be a composer spotlight. We're spotlighting Masafumi Takada. So it's an interesting selection of games there. And then we are doing an October kind of spooky episode for focusing on Castlevania. And then after that, we're going to do another series, Pokemon.
It is impossible to say out loud just how excited Slosey is about this Castlevania episode. So that's definitely one that people want to check out. If you'd like to get in contact with us here at Random Encounter, you can fire me off a message at podcast@rpgfan.com. I'd love to hear from you if you have any ideas for future episodes or themes or just some comments about the show. Would love to hear from you. If you'd like to send me an email, you can do so at jlogan@rpgfan.com. You can also find me on Twitter at Jono_Logan. I am not the only person on this podcast who have an online presence, however. Hilary, where can we find you online?
The best spot to reach me for RPG Fan stuff is Discord. I'm EP Fire there.
Cool. And Aidan, where can we find you online? You might as well drop that URL again for your book again.
Sure, yeah. So you can find information about Fight Magic Items at its official website, fightmagicitems.rocks. And I'm most readily found, I've got a website, but you can usually just find me on Twitter. My handle there is A Dribble of Ink, ADRIBBLEOFINK. And I am there way too frequently. So you'll probably find me there if it's within, waking hours.
Mm-hmm. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends. You can help us get the word out there. You can rate us on iTunes or your other podcast player of choice. Aidan, again, I want to really thank you for taking the time and coming and talking to us about your book. I think you have a real winner here. I really enjoyed it. And just thank you for writing it.
Well, thank you for reading it. Thank you for having me on. It's been such a pleasure to talk about these games and this book and to share the stories, that I discovered along the way with you and with other readers. And I hope the RPG fan community enjoys it as much as I enjoyed writing it and you guys enjoyed reading it.
Yeah, as much as we all have with this episode too.
Mm-hmm. Hilary, of course, thank you again for joining me for another RPG or Random Book Club episode. We'll have to do this again in the future.
Yeah. It's so much fun.
And I'm really looking forward to doing some adventure gaming with you over the next month.
I know. We're tied up a lot for podcasts. It's great.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here. A lot of games to play. And to everyone out there listening to this episode, whatever you're playing, have fun.